Hi everyone, thanks a lot for watching this short video game on the Microsoft Azure Identity Access Management. In the previous video, we talked about Google IAM, and if you haven't got a chance to watch that video, please do so. If you are covering Google Cloud in your day-to-day job, in case you guys have any questions related to Azure IAM, please feel free to put it in the chat window. So without further ado, let me kickstart today's presentation. So this is the brief agenda I have put together. First of all, we will try to understand what are the different types of identities exist within Microsoft Azure. Then we will try to deep dive into the roles. And we will try to understand one of the very key thing is what are the differences between Azure AD roles and Azure roles, and whether there is any overlap between these two roles categories or not. Then we will look into scope to understand what all places the roles can be assigned. And after that, we will spend some time looking into Azure policies and few other guardrails, what Microsoft Azure provides. We may not have a lot of time to cover all these Azure guardrails in a lot more details. Probably we can plan for a further video. And at last, we will be briefly looking into the Azure policy evaluation logic. So let's kickstart. So this is how this entire Azure role-based access control looks like. If you guys have seen my previous video, or if you guys are familiar with Google Cloud Project, so it's very similar. So primarily here also we will be focusing upon 4 W's: who, what, which, and where. In Microsoft Azure, if you combine what and which, it is called roles. So it follows the same terminology as GCP. However, if you guys are familiar with the AWS, you will see in AWS, roles are being considered as one of the identity type. So last but not the least is the where or the scope. So here you will see in Microsoft Azure, you can assign the roles at a different scope levels. And again, from the least privilege standpoint, you should be assigning these roles at the lowest level possible. So let's try to understand some of the very basics first. What's Azure and Azure AD tenant and the subscription? After that, we will jump on to the security principles. So here is how Azure AD tenant and subscriptions are related. The first thing you will see whenever you sign up, the first thing what's going to happen behind the scenes, Microsoft will create a Azure AD tenant for you, or Azure AD tenants get provision. And any tenant you will see, it will get a unique ID, which is being referred as a tenant ID. So basically, it represents a single organization. So we will look into more details. What are the different security principle resides within Microsoft Azure AD? And primarily these identities sitting in Microsoft Azure AD can be assigned at a different level of permissions for Azure AD side, Azure level, or the Microsoft 365 or Office 365. Whereas subscriptions are nothing but, so your Azure billing account, or it can be equivalent to your AWS billing account or AWS accounts as well at any given point of time. So one Microsoft subscription or one Azure subscription can trust only one Azure AD tenant only. And these subscriptions are being used primarily to pay for the resources being spin off within your Azure environment. So this is a little bit about Azure AD tenant and subscription. Let's try to understand the who or Azure security principle, as this is one of the most important parts. So in Microsoft Azure, there are 4 different types of identities exist. So you will see users, groups, service principal. Service principal can be application type or manage identity type. So one key thing you will note, and you will notice in the subsequent slide, that all the security principle on the Microsoft Azure side it gets primarily created or resides in the Azure AD, not onto the Microsoft Azure. It's very similar to Google side. So if you remember from my last video, in the Google side also, your users and groups, they primarily resides on the Google workspace, not into the GCP side. So first, let's look into the users. So here is the screenshot pasted. You can easily see users are being managed in the Azure AD tenants. Again, all these are the local users in my screenshot, but you can easily synchronize your users sitting in your Active Directory to the Microsoft Azure AD using the Azure AD Connect or something like that. So one key thing to take note, these users doesn't get created within your Azure subscription or a Azure management group. So this is the one of the very key thing to take note. The next category is called Azure groups. So here you can see from the screenshot, I have like 3 different groups present in my Azure AD tenant. Again, the whole idea of group is like, so your multiple users can be part of the Azure AD groups, and whenever you are assigning the roles, you can assign the roles to at the group level rather than assigning it for each and every individual users here. Then the third category type is called application. Again, like your users or group, your application also gets created and being managed on the Azure AD side. So the whole idea of application is like if you want to onboard any of the SaaS or the web-based application, or if you want to treat your Azure AD as your IDP, so that's where you will be creating one of the application. In my screenshot, I created like one of the application for AWS IAM. Another use case could be if your on-prem application, they want to have some sort of access to your Azure AD or Azure environment. So that's where you have to create an application. You have to assign a appropriate permissions. The last identity type is called managed identity. It's very similar like your AWS IAM roles. So where you will primarily assign the IAM roles to your EC2 instances or to Lambda. And if your EC2 instances want to communicate to your S3 bucket or communicate to any set of resources, you don't have to provide any kind of credentials at all. So in the Microsoft side, they call it managed identity. So it primarily comes into picture if you want to remove the need to manage the credentials. For example, if your application sitting in Azure side, and then it wants to communicate to your Azure storage resources, or if it wants to communicate to the Azure Key Vault, so that's where the managed identity comes into picture. Again, it primarily helps you to eliminate the secret zero problem. So this managed identity, it can be a system assigned or it can be a user assigned. In later part of my slide, we will be looking into some of the differences. So one last thing, again, you will observe, you will see in my demonstration 2 slides further, that whenever you will be creating any kind of a managed identity, what Microsoft is going to do behind the scenes, it will be creating a service principal. So this is how this entire managed identity OpenID Connect workflow looks like. In this example, for example, if your virtual machine wants to communicate with the AKV or Azure Key Vault, so first thing what you have to do, you have to assign a managed identity to your VM. It will automatically create a service principal. So whenever your VM has to call upon a metadata service, it will get a short-lived token, and it will use the same short-lived token to communicate with Azure Key Vault. Then Azure Key Vault behind the scenes, it is going to check with the Azure AD side here whether the token is valid, whether it has all the appropriate permissions or something like that. If everything's okay, then the request is gonna go through. So this is how this entire workflow is gonna look like behind the scenes. There are 2 different kinds of managed identities exist in Azure, system assigned and user assigned. So system assigned gets created and deleted as part of the resource creation or the deletion. Whereas user assigned identity gets created and managed separately. In case, like for example, in case you are creating a VM scale sets, or you are creating a multiple VMs, and all these VMs, they want to have an access to a specific set of resources, then it's better for you to leverage upon a user identity rather than leveraging upon a system identity. So let's look into the brief demonstration of the managed identity, and you will see whenever we are creating a managed identity, so Microsoft will create a service principal behind the scenes. So here we are trying to, here we are into the Microsoft Azure console. So here we are trying to create a managed identity. So you will create a managed identity. And again, here I'm leveraging upon my Azure subscription number 1. And then you have to define the region name. So where you want to create this managed identity. And then I'm just naming it like XYZ system managed identity or something. So ideally it should be named as a user managed identity. So anyhow, so then once you click on next, and then you can assign all the different tags and so on. So once you click on a create, so Microsoft Azure is going to create a resource, and then you can go to the resource group, or you can go to the specific resource. Here we are going to a specific resource. So what we have created. So here you will see the subscription ID, client ID, and the principal ID. So then we will jump onto the Azure AD side, and then we will try to match some of these. Here you will see the tenant ID is your Azure AD tenant ID. Then the principal ID is nothing but your service principal object ID and the client ID. Here I'm onto the Microsoft Azure AD console. And here here you can see one more enterprise application has been created. The name has been provided as the same. So here you can see the application ID and the object ID is matching to what has been created on the Azure, on the Microsoft Azure side. So far we have briefly talked about who or security principal. Now let's talk about Microsoft role. So roles are nothing but it's a combination of your which and what. So here roles in Microsoft Azure, it's very similar to the GCP roles. It is primarily the collection of the permissions. So there are two different category of roles exist in Microsoft Azure side. So it can be your Azure AD role or your Microsoft Azure role. So in the Microsoft Azure role, you will see there are three different categories, like your classic, your built-in, or Azure custom roles. So for the today's presentation, we will not be deep diving into the Azure side, AD side of the roles, as our intention is to primarily focus upon Microsoft Azure RBAC. So to put everything into perspective, this is how the Microsoft Azure roles is going to look like. Again, it's a JSON. So you will be seeing four different action, not action, detection, and not detection. Again, we will be talking in lot more details what this is all about. So first, let's try to understand. So what's the differences between Azure AD roles and Azure roles? Because many times it gets quite confuses what's the purpose of each of these categories. So Azure AD side is more onto the management of your Office 365, your users, your application, etc. Whereas at the Azure level, so it's primarily residing within your Azure subscription. So whatever the resources you want to spin off, your databases, virtual machine, that's where Azure roles comes into picture. In both the categories, in both Azure AD and Azure side, you will see it do support a built-in and custom roles. Again, on the Azure AD side, your roles can be defined at the organization level, at the entire tenant level, at the specific AU level, or the individual application level. Whereas on the Azure side, you will see scope can be uh, can be can be assigned at the management group level, at the subscription level, or the resource group or the resource level. So both Azure AD and Azure roles can be assigned using the portal, using the APIs, or using the CLI manner. So similar to GCP primitive role, Azure side also got like similar kind of a primitive role. So here, there are three different role types exist. So primarily, I never used such kind of roles before, but just for the sake of your information, these are the three different roles type here. The first type is called account administrator. It is equivalent to your billing owner role, but it don't have any capabilities to cancel your Azure subscription. The next role type is service administrator. It is equivalent to owner role and can help you to cancel your subscription. The last category is called co-administrator. Co-administrator is equivalent to your owner role, but it doesn't allow you to change the association of your subscription to Azure AD tenant. So lastly, because these roles are seldom being used, ideally we shouldn't be using at all. So that's where for the today's context, we shall be focusing a lot more on the Azure built-in or the custom roles. So next category is called Azure built-in role. It can help you to provide a fine-grained permission. Within Microsoft Azure, there are 70 plus built-in roles exist, such as like owner, contributor, your user access contributor, storage reader, your virtual machine administrators, and the readers, and so on. So these roles are being maintained and managed by Microsoft. So at any given point of a time, if your users needs to do like multiple jobs or the multiple roles, you can assign the multiple roles to the specific user. And similar to GCP, most of these built-in roles, generally these are the broad permissions role. Ideally, it is a good starting point for most of the organization, but looking at the principle of least privilege, you should be moving to the custom roles slowly. And again, similar to GCP side also, here you can assign this role to a different scopes. Again, we will be talking about the scopes a little bit later. So you should be granting these roles to the lowest level scope or the lowest level resource hierarchy perspective. Then the next category on the role is called Azure custom roles. So using these roles, you can assign a specific set of a permission to the security principal. Again, these roles has to be maintained and managed by your own organization. So you should be granting these custom roles also to the lowest level scope or the resource hierarchy possible. So in the Microsoft Azure side also, I mean, they don't provide any kind of a capabilities like GCP IAM recommenders to come up with a specific set of permissions. So that's where you can leverage upon CIAM kind of a tool, which can help you to understand what are the different permissions being used by a given security principal in last 90 days. So recently, Microsoft has acquired a company named CloudKnox. So that could be another tool what you can leverage upon to understand what are the different permissions being used by your entities. And one last thing is there is a limit of around like 5,000 custom roles can be configured in a Azure AD directory. Similar to GCP organizations and folder on Azure side, like generally you will have a lot of Azure subscription, and most of the time you have to figure out a way to efficiently manage the access, manage the policies and compliances for all these subscription. So that's where Microsoft, they provide a capability called management groups. So it can help you to group your multiple subscription. Once you are able to group it, then you can assign it different policies and different access and the privileges. So this is how this entire thing is going to look like. Again, at the root side, you will have a root management group. Below that, you can create multiple management group per business unit. So here, like if you look at the screenshot, you are able to see the human resources, IT and marketing. That's how you can categorize it. Below the human resources, you can have a multiple subscription, or you can have another another management group as well. So it is quite flexible. So in my test environment, so this is how the very simple management groups I created. So here, if you see under my tenant root group, I got like two different management groups, production environment and the testing environment. Under the production environment, I got only one subscription. Under the testing environment, I got two different subscriptions for a different purposes and so on. So many times, again, we have briefly touched upon what's the difference between Azure AD roles and Azure roles, but many times there has been a misconception that once you have been assigned a global administrator permissions, so which is like a God level permissions on the Azure AD side, you can pretty much do anything on the Azure side as well, but that's wrong. So here, one thing to take note that there is no overlap between Azure AD roles and the Azure roles. However, any of the global administrator user on the Azure AD side can have an access management to the Azure resources. All they have to do, they have to go to the properties, and that's where they have to enable the access management for Azure resources. And once they do that, they will be assigned a user access administrator privileges at the root management group. So this is how the screenshot is going to look like. Again, this was my test user, like Rajnishka or something. So once I added my user into the resource management, so that's where my user has been added into the Azure management group or the tenant root group as a user access administrator. Again, I got a very quick demonstration as well to showcase how does these things is gonna look like. So behind the scenes here. So here, the first we are onto the test user. So you will see I got like another two tabs open. So here the role has been assigned to this particular user is a global administrator. And so this is my like user principal name. And if I go to my tenant root group, if I search in on a tenant user, you will see there are no permissions assigned by default. And same thing goes for like on the Azure subscription as well. So here, what we are going to do, we are going to the properties again, and then we will try to add the access management. This user can add himself for the access management. Once you click on save, and in a couple of minutes time, you will see this user has been added as a user access administrator to the root tenant group here. So what I'll do, I'll go to the Azure management group now, and let's see whether this user has already been added or not. It takes a couple of minutes for user to appear. So as of now, I think whatever the changes we did, it hasn't taken an effect yet. So I think once we refresh slowly, it takes like 30 seconds to 1 minute here to take the entire effect here. So once we do that, so now you can see this test user has already been added to the root management group and with a user access administrator permissions. And then if I go to any of the subscription, you will see, so because once the user has been added to the root group, it will automatically get inherited to the subscription level as well. So that's how it's gonna look like here. So within the Microsoft Azure role JSON, again, you will see there are 4 different types of permissions can be granted. Okay, action, not action, data action, and not data action. Action and not action pertaining to the management plane actions, like if you want to spin off the virtual machine or the databases or the Azure Key Vault and so on. Data action and not data action are pertaining to if you want to read or write from the Key Vault or the storage resources and so on. Effective permission on the control plane side is going to be action minus not action. On the data plane is going to be the same, data plane minus the not data action. I think there is a typo. It shouldn't be the management plane on the data plane side here. So one thing to take note, not action doesn't mean not deny. If you're assigning the permission to the user in some other manner or using a different role, user will still get those permissions, even if it is counted as like a not action. So now we have briefly looked at the Azure role. Then the next question comes, hey, where all you can apply these Azure roles to what all levels? So Azure roles can be applied anywhere. So where you want to assign the permissions, and one should do it on the basis of the principle of least privilege and should assign it to the lowest level scope. So here you can see the permissions can be assigned at the management group level, subscription level, specific resource group, or the specific resource level. So let's look into the role inheritance. So what it means that if you can assign the permissions at any of the higher tier, it will automatically trickle down to the child resources. So you see here that few roles are being inherited from the management group, and then few roles are being directly inherited from the group management groups. And last but not the least, there are few roles has been assigned directly at the subscription level, and so on. So that's it, a little bit about like all the different roles, scopes, and the security principle. So let's briefly look into Azure guardrails and security principle. For this one, our video is getting a little bit long, so probably we will I will record another set of a video. So thanks a lot everyone for watching this first part of the Azure IAM video. So see you on the next video.